Felt is a non-woven fabric formed when sheep's wool or animal fur is subjected to moisture and pressure or agitation. Wool fibers are made up of a protein called keratin, with an outer layer of scales called the cuticle. Moisture causes these outer scales to open up, and moving the fibers around entangles them, forming a mass of fibers into fabric. It is believed that a chemical reaction takes place between the fibers, binding them together. The characteristic of wool to shrink backwards or creep when it gets wet also helps in the felting process. Soap makes the fibers more slippery, so they become entangled easier. It also helps your hands move over the felt more easily. While heat may not be necessary for felting, it seems to speed up the process. Felt making is a simple technique and believed to be the first man-made fabric. It has advantages over other textile techniques, such as weaving or knitting, in that it requires very little equipment and produces a finished product in much less time.
Hello, I'm Ann Einstead-Vickery. Just by wetting my hands and rolling this wool, I have formed it into a felt rope. Now I can cut the rope into pieces add some soap, and roll each piece into a felt bead. With a needle and yarn, I can thread the beads to make a felt necklace. There are two basic techniques for felt making: the Scandinavian technique, which is used for making hand-formed, seamless, three-dimensional wearables, and the Middle Eastern technique, used mainly for flat pieces of felt, like rugs, blankets, or wall hangings. For this program, we will be using the Scandinavian technique. We will go over the basics for small wearables, covering the following areas: how to choose wool for felt making, how to prepare the wool, how to make patterns and how to adjust them, making a bat for felting, making a felt hat, layering, enveloping, felting, fulling, shaping. And finally, we will look at other felt wearables you can make using the Scandinavian felt making technique.
All wool will felt, but not all wool will felt at the same rate. This sheep breed chart from the American Wool Council shows us that there are many different breeds. In addition, there are many crossbreeds. With so many crossbreeds and different techniques for felt making, you may find that wool that does not felt well with this technique may be good for another technique. Anne wants wool that turns to felt quickly when she works it. She prefers a medium-grade wool that will be comfortable to wear. Very fine wool normally does not work as well with the Scandinavian technique because it tends to float away from the pattern. With so many types of wool to choose from, the only way we can determine how well a particular fleece will felt is to test it. So keep in mind that the felting rate of a fleece does not only vary with the sheep breed, but also with the technique used, the skill of the felt maker, temperature of the water, and the type of soap used.
The amount of wool that you need depends on the size of the project and how thick you want the felt to be. The thicker the felt is in a wearable project, the more durable it will be. For this fedora, I used 3 ounces of carded wool. But if I want a hat that has a wider brim, I would add 1/4 to 1/2 ounce more. For slippers, I use 4 ounces of carded wool for an adult size and 2 to 3 ounces for a child size. If it's a larger adult size, I would need to add some more wool. Wool is available in different forms, as unwashed, uncarded fleece, which needs to be washed before you card it for felt making. And this is the same fleece that has been washed. What I do is I take the fleece and I soak it in a bathtub of hot water with some liquid dishwashing detergent, and then rinse it until the soap comes out. But work with it gently so it doesn't felt while you're washing it. Wool is also available as washed and carded roving, or as wool batting. If you purchased unwashed fleece, it needs to be washed and carded before you use it for felt making. To hand card, put a small amount of wool on one of the carders, and then card it, transferring the wool from one carder to the other a few times. If you're blending the fleeces from 2 sheep breeds, put a little bit of each wool from each breed on the carder at once, and then blend them together. After it's well carded, remove the wool from the carder in a flat piece, and then lay it down to use it later when you're making your bats. With a Scandinavian felt making technique, it's not necessary to wash the wool before carding it, as long as the wool isn't too dirty, because the wool gets washed during the felt making process when we use hot soapy water. Once you have carded enough wool for your project, you are ready to layer it into a bat for felting. If you prefer, you can use a drum carder. When carding the wool, it's easier if you don't build up too much wool on the drum before you take it off. You want the wool to be evenly carded with no lumps or thicker areas, because with thicker areas, they will, when used in a felting bat, they will felt to each other or felt to themselves and not to the wool around it. Then you can pull the carded wool apart to lay down for large pieces, and pull apart areas that are a little thicker. You can also use commercially carded batting or roving. When you make a pattern for small wearables, such as hats, mittens, or slippers, you need to add a 1/2 inch all around your pattern to allow for shrinkage. Patterns that you're going to use for felt making need to be made out of a material that won't disintegrate in water and also that won't felt to your project. Some examples of materials to use are heavy plastic. This was cut from a garbage can liner. You can use foam core poster board, and I taped around the edge of this to protect the edges. You can use polished cotton or an old sheet, Or you can use cardboard, but the cardboard will disintegrate in the water, so you need to cover this with a plastic bag. The basic pattern for a fedora, such as this, is shown here. If you'd like to adjust your pattern to make a hat which is round on the top, you just cut about 1 inch to 1.5 inches off the top of the pattern, and then cut your hat pattern out this way. To get a hat that has a wider brim, such as a cowboy hat, but still has the top like the fedora, leave the pattern as it is, but extend it down on each side and across. For this hat, which has a round top but the sides are going straight down, you take off 1 inch from the top, but then taper the sides in on each side. Once you've decided on the style of hat that you want, we're ready to make the bats. Commercially carded wool in batting is easy to use in felt making, especially for large projects. The wool is carded so all the fibers are laying in the same direction, and thin layers can be pulled off of the bat for your felting bats. It's also easy to use because you don't have to do the carding yourself. Now for a fedora, we need 3 ounces of wool. So I'm going to make a pattern, or lay down my pattern, and then start layering the wool over the pattern. Try to pull off, if you're using batting, try to pull off as thin layer as possible. Because the thinner and more layers, it seems more even the felt will be, or it's easier to make an even felt. Now as I'm laying down the wool over the pattern, I let it extend about 2 inches from the edge of the pattern, and then I can pull off wool that is going out too much. Always pull the wool off. Don't cut it with the scissors, because you don't want that hard edge. Okay, now in this layer I have the wool going from left to right, the fibers going from left to right. So the second layer, as you can see in the picture, I want the fibers to be laying crosswise to the first layer. If there's any holes where you're laying down not as much wool, you can fill them in while you're working. But we want light, airy bats with as many layers as possible. It's important that you get you avoid having thin areas or holes in the bat, because once you start working with water, you can't add any more wool. So this is your chance to make an even felt. Okay, I've got 4 layers here. I'll add a little bit more, and then weigh the bat and see if I have 1.5 ounce, because I'll need 2 bats for the hat, equal weight of 1.5 ounce each. Remember to weigh the bat without the pattern. Now I'm going to prepare another bat in exactly the same way. If you choose not to use wool batting and have decided to card the wool yourself, I want to show you how to layer a bat. With hand-carded wool, we lay down the flat pieces which were taken off the carder on top of the pattern, and with all the fibers laying in one direction. And what we do here is we overlap the layers like shingles on a roof so that we get an even bat. And we also let the wool extend 2 inches out from the edge of the pattern. If you add another piece along a row, just overlap it a little bit with the other piece. Okay, and then remember that your second layer, you're going to be laying the wool crosswise to the first layer, so the fibers lay crosswise. Now if you use drum-carded wool, make sure you have thin pieces that you take off the carder and lay them down with the fibers lying in one direction. Pull off where it's extending more than 2 inches from the edge of the pattern. And as you lay down another piece, overlap it with the first piece a little bit. And add a little bit more wool if you see a thin area. Also, if you have areas that are thicker, try to pull them apart so you're ending up with a light, airy bat. And again, remember the second layer, you'll start the wool laying crosswise to the first layer. Okay, then when using roving, you want to pull off with your hand a small amount and lay it over the pattern. Again, we're going to lay it down in a shingle pattern, overlapping at the edges and also a third of the way up on your second row. You don't want to have a lot of wool in each handful that you pull off because, like I said, you want light, thin layers because it's easier to lay them down evenly in that way. And then again, remember the second layer, you will lay the fibers going crosswise to the first layer. Then when you're finished layering 2 equal weight bats, you're ready to envelop the pattern in wool. Now we're ready for our next stage in the process of making our felt hat. I have 1 bat on this waterproof tray, and I lay it down and center my pattern over it. Then I'll add hot soapy water underneath the pattern, and the water is a solution of hot water as hot as your hands can stand, 2 quarts hot water and 1/4 cup of soap powder. Okay, when you've put the soap underneath the pattern, then put a little bit of water or soapy water on top of the pattern, and then it's easier for your hands to move over the pattern. What you want to do is push the pattern down into this first bat so it lies flat. And when you use a plastic pattern, this is really easy because you just kind of slide it around. With a cloth pattern, you might need to add a little bit more water. And when I add the water, I add a little bit underneath the pattern, not too much. I don't want too much water so that it runs out underneath the dry wool along the sides. Okay, now I have the pattern flat down in my top bat, and
I want to fold this wool, which will be the brim area, over underneath the pattern and over the wet wool underneath. So at the corners, I just kind of pull apart a little bit, and there's a little bit of extra wool here that I take out so I don't have a bulge in the corner. And then lift the pattern carefully just in the bottom in that brim area. And I like to pull the wool out a little bit more, make it more tapered. And then fold it right on that line that I wet down. Fold it back over the pattern and add a little bit more water to wet it down. And then lay your pattern down on top of it and make it flat. So this will be one side of the brim along that edge. Okay, now take the dry wool that's extending out from the sides of the pattern, and you can kind of taper it a little bit at the edges. Don't pull it out too much, and then fold it over the pattern. Don't overlap it, bunch it where it kind of comes together on the top part. And bunch the wool up because you don't want flaps. Okay, and this extra wool that I took off at the edge, I'm just going to lay over this area of the pattern that isn't covered. And you want to be sure that you fold the wool over right at the edge of the pattern. And don't fold the pattern under or over. And then wet down this wool, especially at the edge to hold it down. And then I'm going to add a little bit more water in the middle. And then gently tap it down so it's holding down. Okay, now before I add the second bat, I want to make sure that this area is dry because I don't want a lot of water standing. And always be sure you keep your second bat away from the water or your work area, so well away so that it doesn't get wet. Okay, then take your second bat and center it over the first one with a pattern. And where you wet right at the edge of the pattern, you can kind of push down with your fingers and the soap will come up through that bat. You can just look under, make sure you're pushing in the right place. Okay, now we'll wet down the wool that is over the pattern only, and we'll keep the edge wool dry, and especially down here with the brim. Just kind of pat it down to get the water going through the fibers and holds it in place. Okay, here I'm going to even out this bat because it's extending out further than I want in some of the areas. Okay, then I want to look underneath and find that line where I had the brim on the first side and just pour a little more water there and try to wet down the wool right to that edge of the pattern. And then again, I'm going to pull off that wool on the corner here, so I don't get a big bunch of wool in that area. And I'll do that on both sides. And then I'll taper this brim, the wool that'll be down by the brim, a little bit. I got a little bit too heavy here, so I'm going to take a little extra off. And then I'm going to fold this back on top of the pattern, on top of the back that I wet down. So I'm going to make the other edge for the brim. And then add a little bit more water. So I've wet down the area that's laying over the pattern, and I folded the brim over. Now I need to do something with this wool that is extending out from the edge. So what I'm going to do is pick up the pattern and the wet wool by picking it up from the top, and you make sure your hand or your fingers go down at least an inch, so you're holding on well, and you flip the head over. Okay, then we'll take this edge wool here, which I'll just pull out a little bit, taper it a little bit, and that will fold over this side. So I have my pattern enveloped in the two bats, in two layers. Now when you're making your felt hat, you might wonder when you can take a break or stop in this process. When you're enveloping the pattern, it's important that you start it and then finish enveloping the pattern so that you don't get lost or forget where you are and not flip the hat over. Also, you don't want the dry wool to be sitting in water, because then the seam may not hold together as well when it gets wet. So now I'm wetting down all the wool on top of this, the pattern. I'll just use a little bit more here. Now I'm ready for the next step of felting the fibers. Now we're ready to turn the wool into felt. Since I do so much felting, I prefer to wear rubber gloves at this point. The wool is laying in the arrangement over the pattern for a hat, but nothing is holding it together except for the soapy water. So as we start, we're going to work on it gently so that the fibers don't go away from the pattern, and then gradually the felt will form and become stronger and stronger, and we can use more pressure. I'm adding more hot soapy water and just working on the inside area of the hat. I want to avoid the edges, because if you push down on the edges, then the wool is more likely to go away from the pattern and you'll end up with a much larger hat, or else you might get a roll on the side of your hat. So you can press down on the brim area flat, but otherwise work in the middle, first by just gently pushing down with your fingertips. And you'll feel how the wool feels soft because your fingers go down into it. Work all over the hat, and gradually you'll feel that the wool fibers give a little bit more resistance and feel a little harder. Eventually you can use your whole hand, and just kind of with a rolling motion, I push down with the palm of my hand and then roll out to my fingers slowly, and see how much pressure the wool can take before it comes up off the surface like this. If you're pushing too hard, if you find that the wool comes up like that, either you're pushing too hard in the beginning or else you need to add more hot soapy water. So just continue to work all over the hat evenly and continue this for about 3 to 5 minutes. Okay, now I'm ready to turn the hat over. And again, I need to start gently on this side and gradually increase pressure, working on the inside of the hat and avoiding the edge. If you get a lot of water in the tray, standing water or a lot of suds, you need to get a sponge or pour it off so that you don't have your project sitting in water. The suds get between the fibers and it's harder for them to get together and felt into the hat. So I'm going to pour off some of this water. If the edge area gets a little bit too soapy, you can hold one hand on the edge and then gently push down with the other just to get some of that soap off of it. After you've worked on both sides of the hat, you're ready to open it up and work on the seam areas. The seam areas are still soft, so you have to work gently on them. First, put your hand on the inside and then gently push down with your other hand on the top, the outside, to flatten that part. And work all around the hat to get the whole seam around the outside. If you need, add more hot soapy water. I'm just pushing down to flatten that area and then kind of pushing it together between my hands. This is the area that we avoided when we worked on the front and back. When you finish that seam area, then you can work all over the hat on the inside and the outside, rubbing with your hands to make the wool be stronger. With one hand on the inside, just press in all over the hat to compress those fibers. If the hat gets too soapy, you can take some clear water and pour on it to get some of the soap out. Now you can work all over the hat, with one hand inside and one outside. As you can see, the hat is starting to have some shape, but it's large and it's very floppy. Just continue working on it all over till you get the felt a little stronger. And the next step is fulling the felt on the washboard. Depending on the felting qualities of the wool that you're working with, it may not be necessary to work all items on a washboard, but when you're making a hat, it's necessary to stiffen the hat so that it'll stand up. I have a washboard here that I've clamped down. You might use a washboard in a sink, or you could use a drain board or a felting board. The first part of the hat that I want to make stiff is the middle or the body of the hat, so that I can get the hat, make the hat stand up on the table. First I'll remove my pattern, because I don't need it in this step. And with one layer of felt between my hand and the washboard, I'm going to gently push down and compress that layer of fibers and push it back and forth a short distance over the washboard. And I'm working in this middle area, not the brim or the top, but in this middle area of the hat. And after I work one area for about a few seconds, I'll move on to the right next to it and push down and repeat. Be sure that you have enough hot soapy water and the hat is saturated with water at this point, because you don't want to be rubbing dry wool on the washboard. It tends to pull it apart rather than make it felt better. So I'm going to work all around the body of the hat. And when I've gone around once, then the next time I go around, I can use a little bit more pressure and rub it a little bit greater distance over the washboard. Now, when using a washboard, the direction that you're rubbing is the direction that the hat will, or the felt will, shrink. For example, I want to bring this hat in, make it smaller, so I'm rubbing it in this direction on the washboard. If I wanted to make the hat shorter, then I'd rub it in this direction. Already I can feel that the felt is getting a little stiffer. You don't want to start out rubbing over too great an area in the beginning, because the felt is not as strong and it tends to pull apart if you rub it too hard. So just start gently. And I've gone around a couple times. It's not quite, it's getting a little bit stiffer, but not quite the way I want it. So I'll use a little bit more pressure and push with one hand underneath. I can push down with the hand over to give more pressure, make it felt more quickly. Now, some wool felts and shrinks much faster than others, so be sure that you don't shrink your hat too small when rubbing it on the washboard, and rinse it out and try it on during the process. Okay, I can feel that this hat is really getting a lot stiffer, and as you can see, it stands up better now. Now I'm ready to rinse it out and work more on shaping it. So the next step will be shaping our hat. Now that you've worked on the hat so that it's stiff and stands up, and also that you've worked around the crown but avoided the brim, you're ready to rinse the hat out and try it on. Just plunge the hat into warm or cold water, or else rinse it under running water. And squeeze out as much water as you can. Then roll it in a towel to blot it dry. Okay, when you unroll the hat, you might want to try it on to make sure that it's not too tight around the headband area. If it is, then you want to be sure to avoid working that area that we worked before so that you don't shrink the hat anymore. And also, while the felt is wet, you can put your hands on the inside and push out to stretch out the felt. Now we will be working on the brim area to toughen that area and eventually working all over the hat. Add hot soapy water again. And you can just add it to one part at a time where you're going to be working. And push down with a brim between your hand and the washboard. And with as much pressure as you can exert, rub back and forth about a ½ inch over the washboard. And do this all around the brim, because now we're stiffening that brim. And as you feel the felt is getting harder and tougher, then you can rub a little further over the washboard. So now we're working with the hat in this upright position rather than laying flat. And now that I've gone around once, I'm going to rub a little harder next time. Now during the shaping of the hat, as it gets soapy, you can plunge it in hot or cold water to rinse it out and just try it on while you're working on it, because you don't want it to get too small and you want to have some control over the shape. Now here where I feel like the brim is a little bit too wide, I'm going to rub it in the opposite direction on the washboard, just to make it more even with the rest of the brim. So just continue to work around the brim, shaping it to it's the way that you want. Okay, every so often check the shape, and also if there's some areas that are soft, not as felted so hard, and are softer, add hot soapy water and work those areas too. For the crown, make your hand into a fist and kind of rub with a lot of pressure in a circular motion so you get that evenly felted. Okay, I'm going to work a little bit more around this hat band area to make it more smooth. You can see it's a little bit wrinkled here. So I just add hot soapy water to that one area, and then with just using 2 fingers on that area, I press down and work all around the inside of the hat. And that makes the hat smaller around that area, the hat band. Now if there's pieces like here on the brim or places you think that need to be cut, don't cut them until you have really, you're all finished and you feel like you're almost ready for the final rinse. Okay, now it's time to rinse the hat out again and see if it fits. I'll blot it in a towel again. And when it's wet, the hat is floppier than when it dries because it's heavier. So you can sort of figure out how you want the brim, where you want the front and the back, and then try it on. Now this hat fits pretty well around my head, but I need to do more work on the brim. I don't want it any smaller, I don't think. So what I'll do is add more hot soapy water and continue to press down on the brim till I get it stiffer, and then I'll cut the edges to make it even. Now I've finished shaping the hat and I've rinsed out the soap. As you can see along here, there's this nice rolled edge along the hat. Now if your hat is uneven, if the brim is uneven, you'll need to cut it to make it more even, but then you'll have to work that cut edge to refelt it. You can also use an iron and steam the brim and steam the rest of the hat. After the hat is dry, a wonderful characteristic of felt is that you can crush it up or put it in your suitcase, and when you take it out, it springs back to its original blocked shape. Now let's review the steps in Scandinavian felt making. Remember, the basic steps we went through were making a pattern, preparing the wool, layering the bat, enveloping the pattern, felting the wool, and fulling the felt to shape your hat. Now that you know the basic process for the Scandinavian felt making technique, you can use the same technique to make other items of felt, like mittens, berets, or boots. Instructions for these projects and others are found in my book, Felting by Hand. If you're interested in learning more techniques like surface design on felt, or how to construct a larger garment like this jacket that I'm wearing, I'll teach you how in my next video, Felt Making, Garments and Surface Design Techniques.